All right. Welcome to the second of our lectures in week 7 of Church History 500. These are the beta lectures. And as a result of this lecture, I would expect that the student would be able to describe the various contributions of the medieval period, both positive and negative. The student will explore the nature of scholastic methodology, and the student will evaluate how helpful those contributions were in understanding biblical Christianity. So when we talk about scholasticism, we're talking about the schools. The medieval period was a period in which various schools developed. And the time period between the faltering of the Western Roman Empire and the revival of classical learning in the Renaissance has been known by a couple of different terms. A lot of times it's known as the Middle Ages, the middle period between classical Rome and the revival of classical Rome, right? Sometimes it's referred to the Gothic period. Sometimes it's referred to the Dark Ages. It's referred to the Gothic period because this was the time of the barbarians, the non-Romans, the Franks and the Vandals and the Celts and all them. It's referred to the Dark Ages sometimes because it has a reputation of being a low point in classical learning. Ancient Rome was one high point, the Renaissance was another high point. But I think we'll see that this middle period had its own learning, had its own contributions. Because in the wake of the collapse of the Roman infrastructure, cathedrals and monasteries filled the void with almost everything from public infrastructure, public governance, to preserving classical learning. The medieval calling was to ora et labora, to pray and work, and a part of the work that they invested themselves in was in learning. Monasteries kept libraries, they copied texts, they passed on this learning to others. And this function of the monastery eventually developed into a school, places where people would come and prepare for the ministry by studying the texts that these monasteries preserved and learning from the monks who got to read these texts. So if the scholastic period, if medieval scholasticism refers to the schools, then what were the schools? And we're going to talk about them in two phases. And the first phase were the early monastic schools, the schools that arose between the 6th and the 10th century. And let me give you a couple of examples of these schools. One example was in Ireland. And if we remember the Roman Empire, it stretched from Rome all the way up into Britannia. And as Rome retreated from Britannia, as it was declining before it collapsed, it left two things there, Christianity and classical learning. Specifically the Isle of Iona, the monastery in the Isle of Iona, preserved the text of Aristotle and preserved a knowledge of Aristotle that would not be preserved throughout most of the rest of the Christian empire, and was only recovered after the Crusades brought back Aristotelian texts from the Islamic world. But the Irish monasteries preserved them. Another one of these early monastic centers of learning was Whitby in Britain, England. And there is a particular story that is fascinating about Whitby in the 7th century. And it concerns a farmhand known as Caedmon. Caedmon is presented in the records as illiterate and uneducated. But we read this story of Caedmon where he was sitting around the campfire with everyone else from the abbey, and they didn't have Netflix and they didn't have movie theaters, so the way they would entertain themselves is passing around an open lyre, and people would strum this lyre and sing songs, and the lyre would get passed around the campfire. And as the story goes, it came to Caedmon, and he ran away embarrassed because he couldn't sing and he couldn't create beautiful poetry. and he hid in a barn. And according to Caedmon, he was visited by an angel that instructed him to go and sing of creation. So he returned to the campfire circle and took the open lyre and sang in Anglo-Saxon this beautiful song of creation. And Caedmon continued to be one of the leading poets of 7th century England. His legacy is preserved in the band Caedmon's Call to sing about creation, right? But what's shocking and revolutionary about this is not the fact that someone sang of creation. It's the fact that Caedmon sang it in Anglo-Saxon. Because the official language of the church in those days was Latin, and if you wanted to say something about God, it should be said in Latin for the Latin speakers to hear it and evaluate it and critique it and all that. But Caedmon thought that it was perfectly acceptable to speak about God in his native tongue. And this is one example among many of what we call British exceptionalism. The belief that there's something special about Britain. Exceptionalism eventually gave way to American exceptionalism. But as if you study the history of Britain, the histories of Geoffrey of Monmouth, King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII eventually concluded, why do I need a pope? I can just give myself a divorce. That was more complicated than that, but that was the underlying attitude there, that there's something special about Britain. And Caedmon is an example of that. Third example of learning in these monastic schools was Charlemagne's Aachen. And if we recall from our lecture on Germanic Christianity, Charlemagne called Alcuin of York, this British monk who is highly educated, to come to Aachen, come to the Frankish kingdom, and overhaul the educational system there. And we talked about the development of uncials. I forgot if we talked about maybe Alcuin's greatest contribution to the Frankish world was the introduction of the classical pattern of the liberal arts. And just to give you a sense of what the liberal arts are, the opposite of the liberal arts is not the conservative arts. That's not the meaning of the term liberal there. The opposite of the liberal arts is the servile arts, because the word liberal comes from the Latin word liber, to make free. Servile arts are the arts that prepare you to serve someone. And this usually included the trivium and the quadrivium. So the trivium was grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium was arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, I believe. So Alcuin replicated this pattern of classical learning at Aachen there. But I think just one more note on the liberal arts. The liberal arts are designed to free someone, to equip someone to enjoy the world no matter what he or she does, right? You can be a janitor, and if you have a liberal arts education, you can pick up a work by Shakespeare and know enough to appreciate it, to derive enjoyment from Shakespeare. And if you have a liberal arts education, you should know enough about science to know a little bit why this Nobel Prize-winning thinker is important, or why the discovery of a new planet is important. A liberal arts education should give you enough history to know whether or not a current event is a significant event. And it doesn't matter what you do, the liberal arts prepare you to enjoy the world around you. The servile arts prepare you to do a trade. And your entire life you will always serve someone else. And if you don't have a base level of knowledge, you're not free to enjoy the world around you. Right? And that's why I'm a big fan of the liberal arts. No matter what you end up doing, know the world well enough to derive enjoyment from it. That's the liberal arts. So Alcuin came in and set up this system with the Franks at Aachen. A little bit later on, we have a school developing at Chartres Cathedral in France. And this is dated to 1020, AD 1020. hosted by Chartres Cathedral, and it produced a number of influential scholars, including Bernard of Chartres, Terry of Chartres, William of Conches, and John of Salisbury. And while every medieval monastic or cathedral school operated on this classical pattern, the trivium and quadrivium, every school usually had its own specialty. And at the School of Chartres, its specialty was the natural sciences. Another example of these cathedral and monastic schools comes from the School of Saint Victor. The monastic school was founded in Paris as part of an Augustinian abbey, and it was founded by William of Champeaux, and he was the tutor of Peter Abelard. And it produced a number of famous scholars who usually bear the appellation of Saint Victor: Richard of Saint Victor, Hugh of Saint Victor, and its students became known as the Victorines. And while this school would persist for a few centuries, its influence waned in the 13th century, allowing another institution in Paris to grow. So at this time, after this phase of monastic and cathedral schools that were designed primarily, if not exclusively, to prepare someone for the ministry, a new type of educational system emerged, the university. And the university was designed to bring unity to diversity. So we get the term university from. So they would not only teach theology and ministry, they would teach law and medicine and the arts as well. And the oldest of these universities, or at least the oldest still in operation, is the University of Bologna, founded in 1180. Other monastic and cathedral schools preceded it. There was a university in Fez, Morocco that preceded it by a couple hundred years. But that is the oldest university in continuous operation today. The next best claim comes from Oxford. That was formally founded in 1200, but there's evidence that instruction went back to 1096. Cambridge came a few years later in 1209. And this university movement swept across Europe as it had in the Islamic world. And these various universities became centers for different schools of thought, and their professors were regularly surveyed to help weigh in on theological issues of the day. So let me give you a couple of examples of these universities that would become influential in our discussion of medieval thought. Founded around 1150 is the University of Paris, and it had all four faculties: arts, law, medicine, and theology. The student body was organized by nationes, or nations. In other words, different areas from France that spoke slightly different dialects. And the University of Paris produced a number of notable students. It had a number of notable professors, including Peter Abelard, Duns Scotus, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas himself. Another early university is the University of Padua. And this school would later become known as a center for humanism and Aristotelian philosophy. The University of Oxford boasted Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, and John Wycliffe. The University of Salamanca was founded in AD 1218 in Spain and became famous for theology and law. The University of Heidelberg was founded in AD 1386, and it would transition from a scholastic university into a humanist and Renaissance university. But the whole point of this survey is to show that this university movement, while it may have started in the monastic schools in Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom and in Britain, it spread through the university in Spain and Portugal and Germany and Italy and France and Britain. So this was a European-wide movement. So these are the institutions that define scholasticism or scholastic thought. So let's spend a couple moments on talking more about what is scholasticism, or what is scholastic thought. While scholars in the mid-20th century used the term scholasticism to refer to a specific type of rationalistic thought, subsequent scholarship has revealed that this term is really referring more to a methodology than a metaphysic. Samuel Rutherford, a 17th century British pastor, writes against the Scholasticai, in works that criticize people that use the scholastic method to come up with certain conclusions. But Rutherford himself wrote a treatise, A Scholastic Disputation on Providence, where he does use this methodology in order to come to what I assume he believes is a true conclusion, right? So Rutherford shows us two different uses of this term: scholastics as being a group of schoolmen, a group of teachers, and a methodology. So what was the scholastic methodology? This methodology had a certain structure and orderliness to it. So a scholastic professor might walk into a classroom and pose the theological question, does God exist? And call on a student, say, give me 3 reasons why God does not exist. And that student is supposed to give the reasons. You might call on a second student, okay, cite an authority that tells us that God does exist. And that student is supposed to provide that. And then the job of the professor is to provide the resolution, is to take aside God does or does not exist and give orderly reasons why, and then show why the other side is wrong. Right? So this is the method that the scholastics used. And in class we will survey some individual scholastic thinkers. And maybe the biggest question during the medieval period for these cathedral and monastic schools, for these universities, is what we call the problem of universals. John of Salisbury stated that it took more time, that the medieval church took more time to sort the question of universals than it took the Caesars to conquer the world. And this may sound obscurantist, but it is the logical consequence of the councils. If you remember, the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople tackled the question of the Trinity. Council of Chalcedon tackled the question of the person of Christ. And these were deep, important, and sometimes abstract questions about God. So it left the church with the question concerning how can we talk about abstractions like the Trinity and the nature of Christ? How can individual Christians make sense of these transcendent truths? And this is what drove the problem of universals in the medieval church. But really, the medieval church was just picking up where Plato and Aristotle left off. Both Plato and Aristotle developed methods that sought to discover the essence of something. Right? Plato looked for essences in the form of, or in the world of forms, the world of ideas. Aristotle looked for essences in the individual or particular objects. But both Plato and Aristotle thought that the driving engine of thought was to discover the essence of something. The medieval church talked about the essence of God, which means they needed to know how to talk about essences so they can talk about the essence, right? And if you remember going all the way back to our introductory lectures, Aristotle made a distinction between 2 categories. He actually had 10 categories. We reduced it to 2. Accidents and essence. Accidental features and essential features. And when we say accidental, we don't mean features that happen by chance. We mean features that are not essential. Let me give you an example. My accidental features are my height, my weight, and my hair color. Right? I could lose 50 pounds and I can shave my hair off my head, and I would still be the same person. Nothing essential within me has changed. Only non-essential or accidental things have changed. However, if you took my humanity away from me, then you have taken something that is essential to who I am, and I would cease to be me. Now, this seems pretty simple and straightforward, but the medieval church wrestled with a deeper question. Are our accidental features universal or particular? Do they belong to the things themselves, or do they belong to a larger concept? Let me try and illustrate this with cars. And I don't know if this is a great illustration. I would, without putting a whole lot of thought into it, I would say that the essential features of a car include its engine and its wheels, that thing that allows it to move, and its seats, the thing that allows it to take people with them. If you take out the engine or the wheels, or anything that causes it to not go, it's no longer a car, it's a lawn ornament. And if you take out the seats, and if this thing rolls around without taking people, it's just a well-engineered stone that's rolling, right? So I'd say that those are essential features of a car. A non-essential feature of a car might include its color. Let's say it's a green car, its greenness. If you painted the car white, it would still be a car, and if you painted it blue, it would still be a car. But the medieval church looked at this accidental characteristic of greenness, and it asked the question, okay, does greenness belong to the individual car, or does greenness belong to a larger concept of greenness? In other words, if you have the same shade of green in car A and car B, do they share greenness, or do they just both have greenness? This sounds like an odd question for us today, but this was critically important to where the medieval church was at and how they developed language to talk about who God is and what reality is, and where do we find reality, right? There was two major approaches, two major answers that the medieval world developed to this question of universals. Is greenness participate in this universal greenness, or is greenness particular to that car? And those who thought that the accidental features participated in this universal reality were known as realists. And you can see how they drew heavily on Platonic thought, the world of forms or ideas. And the realist could abstract the idea or the concept of greenness beyond the car that has it to say that there is something somewhere called greenness. And greenness has its own reality. And those who promoted the realist approach included thinkers like Anselm and William of Champeaux. Other thinkers embraced what we know as nominalism. They thought individual accidental characteristics belong to the object itself. So a green car did not participate in a universal concept of greenness. That greenness was a part of that car. So they denied the ability to abstract the concept of greenness out from the car, so to speak. And thinkers like Peter Abelard and William of Ockham, famous for his razor, drew on Aristotle to promote the idea of nominalism. What they would say links that green car and that green car is not a universal reality, but as the word nominalism suggests, that they're only really linked by the word green, that we use the word green to describe car A and car B, but they have no real connection, only through the language that we use, right? This is an oversimplification of what was going on in the medieval period, because you did have thinkers like Aquinas, who was a realist, was not an ultra-realist or an extreme realist, he was a moderate realist, but he did use the metaphysics of Aristotle to get there. So he did not necessarily participate in a Platonic project. I understand that this sounds very unimportant to us today. I might make the case that the reason why it's unimportant for us today is because we have, I think within the Christian church at least, settled this issue and opted for some version of realism. And since this is already decided, this is what we inherited, we don't question it or find it important. But I think it's going to become important for us in our world today, because while it may seem like this scholasticism is scholastic or academic, irrelevant, obscurantist, it actually impacts our lives more than you might think. Because in the modern world, there were many thinkers that rejected Christian realism and opted for some version of nominalism. One example is Friedrich Nietzsche. He expanded on nominalism and declared that we are beyond good and evil. Because this question of abstract reality seems unimportant when we're talking about something like greenness. And greenness is an example to prove a point. It becomes a lot more important when we talk about characteristics like justice or humanity, right? Is there a shared humanity that can be abstracted from the individual person, or is humanity endemic to the particular? And if it's endemic to the particular, is there any larger thing we're trying to defend, right? Nietzsche said that we are beyond good and evil, that categories of good and evil don't exist in reality. They're just words that we use to describe certain types of behavior. Or as Nietzsche reduced justice to something called a will to power. Existentialism claims that our existence does not have inherent purpose, but only the purpose we give it. And this has been embraced by evolutionary biology. I want to illustrate this with a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, a very famous evolutionary biologist. We are here because an odd group of fishes had a particular fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. Because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age. Because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. That's representative of evolutionary biology and their philosophy of metaphysics. What is real? We create reality. Although I do think it's interesting. It says we must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. What do you mean by ethical sense? Anyways. But I hope this quote illustrates the relevance of this problem of universals to our world today. Is there an abstract, transcendent truth and reality that things can participate in? Or is truth the sole possession of individual particulars? Can we talk about justice, or do we have to talk about justices? Can we talk about, ethics, or do we have to talk about many different types of ethics? So I hope you see how the scholastic movement developed through the schools and the universities, and I hope I've given you a good example of one of the central questions and problems that the medieval church had to tackle, and why that's actually still an important question for us today. Thank you for your time.